Good evening, everyone, and just once again, welcome to Ascension Church. And thank you for joining us this evening for Ascension's first of four speakers. In celebrating Ascension's 130th anniversary and the Jubilee Year of Hope, we put together this speaker series, and the first speaker tonight, of course, is Graham Burnett, a longtime parishioner of Ascension, a father of two, and Graham's impressive credentials would take most of the night to read, so I'll condense it just a bit. Graham is a published writer, professor, and a maker based here in New York City. Born in France, he trained in the history and philosophy of science at Cambridge University, and currently he holds the Henry Charles Lea Professor of History and History of Science at Princeton University. He's the author of a number of books on technology, nature, and politics from the 17th to the 20th century. And he recently co-edited Scenes of Attention, essays on mind, time, and the senses, as well as 12 theses on attention. The latter, a manifesto of the Friends of Attention Coalition. Graham's was also a visiting artist of fine arts in Helsinki, Finland. So without going on, I would like to introduce and present to you Graham. I'm privileged and honored to welcome him in your name. So welcome, Graham.
Let's see, is this on? Yes. Okay. But you all can hear me. It's a small group, and we're all just ready. Thank you so much, Father, and thank you all for coming out on a Thursday evening. I plan to talk for maybe something like half an hour, 25 minutes, 30 minutes maybe. We'll see how it's going, and then we'll do some Q&A to see where folks are. And the topic of my talk this evening, the title, is Attention, Activism, and the Spiritual Life. And what I'd like to do is really touch each of those three themes. I want to talk about attention. I think we're at a very interesting historical moment for thinking about attention, and I'm going to try to persuade you all, if you need persuading, that this is a moment for us to be thinking hard about our attention. Then I'll talk a little bit about the group to which Father referred, the Friends of Attention, and the folks at the nonprofit Strother School of Radical Attention in Brooklyn, which is a community of people working to sensitize folks to the importance of our attention now. And then I'll close by sort of tying the history of attention as a problem to the need we have now for focused collective action around attention. And I'll do that through a discussion of the very special role that attention has played historically in our faith and in adjacent faith traditions. Does that make sense? That's the plan for these next few minutes. But before I even get going on that, I just want to take a moment to express from my heart the deepest gratitude for this house where we are right now. This is not an ordinary lecture hall like where I do my attention class with my undergraduates down in New Jersey. This is an incredibly beautiful space, and I bet for many of you here, it's a space in which you feel grace in a very distinctive way. And I would just like to say that for me, this space has been a very powerful and important kind of sanctuary over the last 25 years, which is, it's a long time that the place has been important to me. And I'm going to come back to that word sanctuary, which we know has a special liturgical meaning, but which I think has another important meaning as we reflect on attention. So let me start by talking about attention. As Father said, I'm trained in the history and philosophy of science. That's my field. And you can sort of think, if you haven't run into that field before, you can probably imagine what historians of science, technology, and medicine spend their time doing. I wrote a book that has nothing to do with attention. It has to do with whales and dolphins, and about the scientific study of whales and dolphins across the 19th and the 20th centuries. Who knew what about those animals, and how did they know it, and what difference did it make to our efforts to, for instance, preserve, conserve cetacean populations, stuff like that. So you're studying mathematical biologists who did population models, that kind of stuff. Historians of science, we study science. For the last 10 years or so, I've been studying the scientific study of attention. So who were the psychologists and the sociologists and the anthropologists, the communications researchers and engineers who put people in front of devices to measure how long they could focus on a task, or how successfully they could track a moving percept, a cursor, these kinds of things. And I got interested in that topic because, like many of you, I've noticed that we are living through a revolutionary episode in the history of human attention. Over the last 15 to 20 years, we have seen an industrial scale rise of a new extractive industry, which makes money on our attention. What am I talking about? I'm talking about mostly these kinds of devices. Okay, you know this, you understand. These devices are paid for, everything you see in them is basically being paid for through the extraction of data and through the advertisements which pay to get access to your eyeballs. You have heard this sometimes called the surveillance economy. You've heard it called the attention economy. Our attention has been commodified, turned into money, turned into a commodity in a very new way over the last 20 years. And in the Q&A, if any of you are sort of like, well, how new is that? You might be like, well, there have been ads for a long time, right? Any of you want to have that conversation, we can dig in and talk about the changing history of advertising over the last 100 years. But I can assure you that we have seen an extraordinary explosion of the financialization of our attention. Right now, most of the most brilliant people leaving college and a fair portion of the most powerful computational technologies available, and a considerable portion of the assets in the command of venture capitalists are all going toward getting your grandkid to look over here instead of over there for an additional second. That money is going, those computational technologies are directed to time on device, holding people in their devices for as long as possible, because that is where the money comes from, right? TOD, time on device, which is also the German word for death, as it happens. Tod, right? You knew that. Okay. I teach a class at Princeton, and I have to say that Aaron's son is in that class right now, and he's a very, very good student. If you're out there listening in the live stream, Davey, you're doing well in this class. And that class is a history of attention from the medieval period to now, with a special focus on the scientific study of attention. I'm interested in the way that the incredible diversity and complexity of our attentional lives came across time to be sort of reduced to a relatively simplified monoculture of trigger response, instrumentalized attention, mostly focused on screens. So if you want a metaphor or an analogy, think about the way if you had gone out to Kansas in like 1640, you would have had tall grass prairie with like 130 different species of plant, right? Forbs and grasses and all kinds of stuff. If you go out to that same part of Kansas now, how many different species do you have out there on the prairie? Almost 2, right? You have like soybeans or corn, right? Basically. That's a monoculture. The displacement of a rich ecosystem of diverse stuff by one very simple thing, okay? And it's because of commercialization. I would argue that something similar has happened with human attention over the last 400 years. Attention has been sliced and diced in laboratories en route to being priced in the marketplace. Now, you might have to do my whole class to feel the complete diversity of attentional forms that are out there, but you might not. You could probably just think to yourself for a second. The attention that was mostly studied in laboratories in the 20th century was the kind of attention that was interested to people who were funding laboratory research in the 20th century. Who was mostly funding laboratory research in the United States and the Soviet Union between, say, 1948 and 1980? Correct. And not just like the friendly people in health and human services in the government who had very teeny tiny budgets. The vast majority of that kind of research was being funded by the Defense Department, correct. And the Defense Department was extremely interested in human attention, weren't they? For instance, they needed people to be able to stare at radar screens for very long periods of time. And they needed to be sure that if there was a little beep of a pip on that screen, people would see it. And the other thing that really interests the military is shooting down airplanes, meaning tracking and triggering was an extremely important part of cybernetic attention, the kind of attention that involves humans and machines interacting. So a lot of what we look at in the class is the way that military funding of human attention in the 1940s and 50s and 60s gave us this very particular way of thinking about what attention is, that it is a kind of preparation for an operational task, that it's about tracking, triggering, and vigilance. That those are what we mean when we talk about attention. Is there more to the attentional universe than that? There is, I promise you. And I would say to you right now that our best hope is that we get smarter again about all the different kinds of things that attention can be. Because at present, I would say that this intensive commodification of the tracking and triggering and vigilance kind of attention is bad for us. It's bad for us as individuals. How many of you have like looked up from your phone and been like, why did I lose that? Or you look at your family and you're sort of like, wait, why are we all like this instead of talking to each other? Right? That's real. And I think there's a pretty good argument that this has also been bad for our political culture, the forms of algorithmic siloing of communities and the experience of severing from each other, not to mention the way that the algorithms bias toward our emotional responses like anger and outrage. We, and when I say we now, I mean the friends of attention, remember we were going to do attention, activism, and the spiritual life. You remember? Okay, we're still in attention. We're about to get to activism, okay? When I say we, I mean the friends of attention and this community of folks who begin to work together toward resistance against this heedless and largely unregulated exploitation of a human capacity to care about things. Because that is, after all, part of what we mean when we say attention. Attention is the rich way we care about others and the world and ourselves. It has in it our desires and our hopes and our appetites. It's a pretty capacious, you might even say it's like the instrument of ourselves. It's the way we play ourselves in the world in relation to others. To the extent that that is being narrowed, canalized, and turned into a source of revenue for a, depending on how you do the math, $4 trillion industry, and meaningfully compromising human flourishing, you could get like a bit like concerned about that. You could worry that that's not good. So we actually don't even call it the attention economy, which sounds kind of friendly and like something you might want to get a job in. We call it human fracking. Human fracking. You've heard that term fracking, you know what fracking is? Like petroleum fracking is when you need to get oil out of the deep earth. In the old days, you used to be able to just like drill a hole, and if there was like oil right there, it would like gush up and stuff, like a gusher. There's none of that left. So now, the way they get the deep oil that's in those kind of deep structural layers of the planet is in fact they pump down into the earth high pressure, high volume detergent, which forces the dissolved oil and gas up to the surface where it can be separated from the detergents and monetized. Okay, that's petroleum fracking. And it's a perfect analogy to what's being done to all of us all the time on these things. What is happening is that high pressure, high volume detergent is being pumped into your face to force to the surface a little spume of monetizable attention. Downsides of petroleum fracking, toxicity across the planetary surface, meaningful tectonic disruption of the architecture of the planet, earthquakes and stuff like that. Again, the analogy is pretty good. High level toxicity in our human communities, structural destabilization of the bedrock of personality and intersubjective conditions. Bad. So I'm going to take a word or two to talk about pretty much enough for everybody. If not, I've got some more. I want to take one of these and pass them on. So I've set up the first part of the story. What have I done so far? I've talked with you about attention. I've told you why I think we should care right now about human attention in a special way. I've talked a little bit about the history of the scientific study of attention, and you may have a lot of questions about all that, and if so, in the Q&A we can get to them. I now want to talk about what it means to resist human fracking. If human fracking is what I've said it is, and it's bad, you could think, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to get a screen time app, and I'm going to try to be on my phone for like 20 minutes less each day. I'm going to monitor my usage, and I'm going to try to right? That's cool. I would not say you should not do that. That's fine. Although I would like to note to you that you are, in a sense, out there on your own, trying to solve that problem just yourself, you know? You're feeling like it's you who were bad because you went down an internet hole and you spent 2.5 hours that you didn't mean to on Instagram, right? So the first problem is it makes you feel like it's your problem rather than that there's a systemic, structural problem, right? We sometimes say, don't hate the player, hate the game. Like, pay attention that the problem is the structure, not individuals. So the first thing we would say is, problem with that, you're taking all responsibility for yourself, you've got no friends to help you out. We want you to think in terms of movement and a collective action of resistance. And that's what attention activism is about. And then the second thing we would say is that to the extent you're trying to get 20 minutes back of the kind of tracking and triggering, I'd like to be more efficient and use that 20 minutes to pay my bills this month instead of waste it on TikTok, you see what you're fighting for a little bit more of that very narrow tracking and triggering vigilance kind of attention, that instrumentalized attention that I'm arguing to you is just that monoculture of one soybean kind of attention. And you don't want to be in that fight trying to get back just a little bit more soybeans. So attention activism is the movement that says something's got to give. A $4 trillion industry that is enriching a bunch of venture capitalists while harming our kids and our friends and ourselves and meaningfully compromising our experiences of community and a shared world? No, we need to push back. We'll sometimes say, there's not one environmental crisis, there's two environmental crises. There's the external environmental crisis, global warming, pollution, climate change. And then there's the internal environmental crisis of our psycho-spiritual beings. And we can't solve the external one until we've got our insides better organized. So that's also part of what we mean by attention activism. So I handed you two little documents. One is a card for the Strother School, which is this nonprofit bricks and mortar school. Probably at this point, 35 or 40 facilitators and folks who are working in that space, doing classes and workshops and study to think about attention together, and to begin to work on a curriculum in the schools with folks to think about this question and push it back. The Friends of Attention define attention activism on 3 pillars. We say attention activism is the study of attention, because you got to understand what we're talking about, and study is itself an attentional form, which is kind of interesting, kind of cool. Second, it's about organizing. You're probably already an attention activist. If there's anything you do when the interwebs cannot get at you, we want you to think of that as a form of attention activism. Maybe you do macrame. Maybe you garden. Maybe you're a rock climber. When you're rock climbing, the human frackers cannot get at you. You're with your climbing partner and you're climbing. You're focused on the world, your hands, and where you are and how you're moving in that space. Good. That's attention activism. And we have built a set, if you go online, you'll find this fabulous set of videos with all different kinds of people, including, Father, you'll love it, you know Pietro here from San Egidio? So Pietro has worked with us. His dad's actually teaching a class, I think, next semester. And Pietro brings food to the homeless. He did a video with us on outreach to the unhoused as a form of attention activism. He spends time walking around the city, finding people who are unhoused and in need, and giving his head and heart and time to them. And it's not about like phones, and nobody can frack his like attention when he's doing that. Beautiful short video. So what's attention activism? It's study. It's organizing, meaning it's basically about coalition building so that we can start to have some political power to insist upon regulation in this space, which is happening little by little. And if there are any lawyers in here who want to talk about the status currently of legislation, litigation, and regulation in this space, we could talk about that. So that's the second pillar, organizing. And the third pillar, sanctuary. Sanctuary. And we don't just mean sanctuary like this, although we don't not mean this. We mean that it is absolutely essential that we as individuals and as communities begin to insist on certain kinds of protected space where our attention is not being commodified, where we're not available for fracking. And that is classrooms, right? Ed tech is cool, but increasingly the publishers who produce course materials are using the same techniques of attention capture as the algorithmic systems that are driving the advertising industry. That's no good. We don't want to fight for the kids' eyeballs in the same way that Coca-Cola is fighting for their eyeballs. That's messed up. We want sanctuary. And that, we've just published an article. It was in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences. You can check it out online, which is about the need to create community guidelines or in your family, or in your church group, or in your reading club, your book club. You get together and say, how are we actually going to gather here? When are we going to have our phones out? When are we going to have our laptops open in this class? Maybe we're going to have 20 minutes where we don't do laptops because we want to understand why we're in this room together. And we want to be with each other because that's part of what it is to gather. And you can come up with your own guidelines, but every group of people who come together need to start thinking explicitly about surfacing those kinds of rules. Maybe you have a coffee shop where they won't let you have laptops in the front or the back. That's the beginning of people saying, look, we actually need to have some spaces where we're taking control of this question, and that's going to change. We at the Strother School, Friends of Attention, we allege that we are at the beginning of a revolution in this area, like the revolution against smoking that started 35 or 40 years ago. Right? We're having scientists argue about how much of the mental health crisis that produces like a third of our girls between the ages of 11 and 7 to 18 having suicidal ideation in any given week, how much of that can be attributed to social media use? I could show you the literature. Some people say a lot, some people say a little, some people say they're not sure yet because there isn't enough data. In 1972, there were a lot of articles about whether cigarettes caused smoking, whether cigarettes caused cancer. And there were some people who said yes, there were some people who said maybe a little, other people who said we're still waiting, there's quite a lot of data still to gather. What I'm saying is, we are aware that we need resistance here, and we can't wait until all the data is in. This is going to change over the next decades. So get in on the front lines of this change, okay? Last 7 minutes of my talking to you. Part 3 of this talk, the spiritual life. And I've already tipped open the way that attention activism, though secular, right? It's not a religious movement. We have all different religious people and people of no religion in the movement, but how it can draw on spiritual traditions and on spiritual themes. For instance, by invoking that notion of sanctuary. And I want now to talk about the way our particular tradition can inform attention activism, because it is all hands on deck at this moment as we push back against the frackers. We need everybody who has a traditionary form of grounded, attentional, contemplative awareness to bring that to help us out. We think of museums as attention sanctuaries because there's a long tradition of slow looking in the aesthetic experience protected by museums. We think of libraries as attention sanctuaries. Once upon a time, you went to a library to get a bunch of information. When was the last time you went to a library to get information? Probably not recently, because almost all the information in the universe is readily accessible to you right here. But we still have libraries, and those libraries still have a meaningful tradition of a certain kind of quietude, of a certain kind of inwardness. Reading itself is an attentional practice of some depth and importance. So we think of libraries as sanctuaries, and those forms of bookishness have a new function now as we need to defend very fundamental things about human being from a effectively mechanomorphic, algorithmically driven, AI-powered human threshing machine that is turning all of you into money by going after something so ethereal, so sweet, so central to our being, our ability to care about stuff. Right? This isn't somebody exploiting your ability to dig deep holes. This is people exploiting your ability to be interested in another person. How messed up is that? Let's do the spiritual life part of this story for a moment, because it's very rich. We begin my attention class with a foundational text for thinking about attention in the West, which is St. Augustine's Confessions. Book 11 of St. Augustine's Confessions features the earliest and deepest and richest statement about the nature of attention, really, that we have in the Latinate pre-modern world. In Book 11, St. Augustine speaks to God, and he says, God, I'm in time, and I find this so confusing. Part of my mind is in the past, always. Part of my mind is in the future, always, and always a little bit of me is here now. You made me this way, God, but I don't understand time, or how it is that you put me in time in this way that spreads me out continuously, so I can never be one. Because the past is in me, the future is in me, and I'm shot through with the present always. That condition, he said, is the condition of our fallen humanity. We're in time. And he says, God, I know you're not in time. You're eternal. For you don't have this. And I want you to bring me home. Make me one again, so that I could not be spread out this way. And the term he uses, distendio, it's literally like distension, and its opposite is attention. What it would be for Augustine to be capable of pure attention would be to be gathered up so that one would be unitary, and in that unity, one would catch a kind of glimpse of the eternal. That wholeness or oneness is divine, and it's eternal. Now, I tell you that both because it's extremely moving to me, I have to say, and because it's a reminder of the stakes for attention in our intellectual tradition. You're worried about your attention and whether, you're having trouble focusing and maybe you need to take an increased dosage of Wellbutrin or, whatnot. I mean, and that's all real. That's important. But I want to remind you that that kind of attention, your ability to keep looking at the stuff on your screen that your employer wants you to look at, that definition of attention, again, the instrumentalized, operational, task-oriented, tracking and triggering and vigilance kind of attention, okay, that's what we mostly talk about now. But if you were in the 4th or 5th century, back there with St. Augustine, the ideal of attention would have been nothing other than redemptive. Attention across 1,000 years of Eastern and Western monasticism, attention was redemptive. It was the way one, through opening oneself to grace, caught a glimpse of the unity that was in us and that was a flame of the divine. So that idea that attention has or has had redemptive power is a real reminder of that richness and complexity of the ecosystem of attentions that has been increasingly replaced by an understanding of attention that is basically like continuous, a very impoverished understanding of attention. Okay? So I want you to feel that Augustinian ideal of attention and find it anchored in our spiritual tradition very deeply. I won't now because I want us to move to, we're basically at time and I want to be faithful to that, but there are other ways that attention figured in ethics, in epistemology, across the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. Some of you will know Ignatius. Some of you may have known a Jesuit. Some of you may have heard about Ignatian spirituality and the centrality of the spiritual exercises. Spiritual exercises are like a democratization of monasticism in the Counter-Reformation, and they center on a set of contemplative practices that are sustained meditative acts of imaginative attention. And they're inextricable from the formation of modern selfhood in the late Renaissance. Super interesting story. But I'm going to bracket that story, and I'm just going to tell you about my kind of 20th century hero in all this, who's not a Catholic. She never converted, but some of you will know Simone Weil, W-E-I-L, the great French mystic of the 20th century, who was a radical, a complicated character. She, as some of you will know, probably, well, I think on her death certificate it says she killed herself, she starved herself. Questionable whether she starved herself, but she was an ascetic to such a degree that in solidarity with the suffering victims of Nazism on the continent, she ceased to eat and eventually passed away in a kind of extravagant gesture of empathy for the suffering victims of the Third Reich. She was a very serious lady. And she trembled on the edge of a conversion right up to the end of her life, and people still debate exactly where she fell on that moment. Her writings on attention deeply inspire the Friends of Attention, and that manifesto that's on the blue sheet, the 12 Theses on Attention, which the Friends wrote together as a manifesto, is deeply inspired by Simone Weil's language. And I'm just going to give you two of her beautiful quotes, which are like the Augustinian project from the 4th, 5th century, brought forward to the 1940s when she was doing her writing. And this is from her great posthumous work, Gravity and Grace. Absolutely unmixed attention is prayer, she wrote before she died. And she continued, the authentic and the pure values, truth, beauty, and goodness in the activity of a human being are all the result of one and the same act, a certain application of the full attention to the object. Weil's theory that attention was at the heart of the possibility of human goodness is the most extravagant philosophy of attention that we inherit. And if you all want to talk about it more, I have a lot of things to say. But I think what we should do right now is I should say thank you to you for your attention. Okay? Thank you very much. We have time for a few questions. Yeah, what's on y'all's mind at this point out of all that? Yes.
I would wonder if it's quite discreet to describe, because I thought that during the pandemic, we started having hands.
Yeah.
Like, television is not quite the same as phone, to get it.
For sure. For sure. Yeah, so a wonderful question you heard. Sort of like, what about all the ways, and I'm paraphrasing the question, what about all the ways that these new technologies facilitate and enable forms of human connectivity and even forms of like spiritual connection? And let me be very clear, I love my phone. I think phones are really cool. And in fact, I would say I'm a accelerationist with respect to most features of technology. I have my undergraduates working with AI all the time. They have to do assignments using chatbots in my class. So let me be clear, we are not just talking about sort of like, hey kids, get off your phones. because that's like, the kids are very tired. I have 2 kids, as Father said, 16 and 18. They're not listening right now. And because they get this at home. And, but the truth is, they're like, yeah, no, the phones are really important and cool, and they are. So for instance, at the Strother School, we do whole workshops on the attentional formats that the phones make possible. We use the phones for everything. In fact, we even love TikTok. I personally love TikTok. TikTok's really cool. There are like TikTok, like there's whole like lines of crazy TikTok whatnot that are pure attention acts. For a while there was one, I think this is okay to say in church, where you could like look at, you did TikToks on looking at something and imagining what it would be like to lick it. Which is like, on one hand, kind of like, okay, some of them were a little inappropriate, but actually from like a performance art perspective, having literally millions of Americans imaginatively licking things around the room, the Strother School supports that kind of activity and thinks of that as an extremely interesting form of attention activation. So we are in favor of technology, in favor of phones. What we are against is heedless and unregulated human exploitation, and new technologies make possible new forms of exploitation. Good analogy, Industrial Revolution. Steam engines bad? Not really. I mean, steam engines is steam engines, sort of. Satanic mills of Lancashire? Bad. You couldn't harm people in the ways that capital and harmed labor in the 19th century with the rise of industrial textile production until you had steam engines and industrialized factory scale labor production, because you couldn't chain a human to a loom if they were like working on a spinning wheel. But you could chain a person to the mill of industrial textile production. That new form of technology made possible a new form of human exploitation that was at odds with human flourishing, and what happened? People gathered together and they resisted. They created new forms of solidarity in the forms of trade unionism and labor activism and labor law, and they refused to work, and sometimes they had to violently destroy the machines to make their point. So we're at a similar point. We're being harmed. We need to stop the harms, and that requires collective action, and that's exactly what we mean by attention activism. Great. How do we accomplish collective action? Yeah, well, you write a lot of, no, it's not, but you can learn things from our forefighters in movement politics. So, in short, it depends on like what level you want me to answer that question in a way. Like, creating a movement involves writing many, many emails. It involves teaching classes and galvanizing people. It involves coming out on a Thursday evening to do what we're doing right here. It's happening. We're making a movement right here. I'm handing out the literature and I'm saying, come to Brooklyn, come help us out. If you know somebody who you think would be interested, let them know. And then there are different scales. Like, I run a nonprofit. I spend my time out trying to raise money and writing grant applications to fund the work we're doing. And Father knows this. We were very successful last year. 2 years ago now, we had an op-ed in the New York Times that got a lot of attention, and then there was a piece in the New Yorker, and then I was on the Ezra Klein show, and then we sold a book contract to Crown for like $300,000, and we used all of that money to go to the nonprofit. Now we're writing the book. We want that book to be like Silent Spring for this issue and like change the conversation. And the fact that Crown put like over $250,000 into it means that we think that they're going to promote the book. And so, you know, that's how you do it. And we're getting traction. We have, I'll say one more thing and then I'm going to go here and here. We have like whatever, year and a half ago, we had no followers on Instagram. Now we have about 6,000 followers on Instagram. We put out a call saying, hey, are you an attention activist? Write us and tell us what you do. We made this term up. I mean, 2 years ago, no one was like, you an attention activist. We had 100 people write in and say, yes, I'm an attention activist. Then we took those people and we said, we're gonna have a fellowship competition where we're gonna give $1,000 to like 5 different attention activism projects all over the country. Write in a one-page proposal for what you would do if you had $1,000 to promote attention activism. We got 70 applications. We met a committee together. We gave the money out. We brought them to New York to teach them our organizing skills. We're actually now doing a second round on that because that was so successful that we're doubling the size of it. So we're creating a national network. I'll say that, that's just us. There are many other folks doing this work in other places. I have a set of colleagues in Europe. They call themselves the Buddhist Fight Club because they're all Buddhists. They're like professors of Buddhism and whatnot. They just did a big manifesto on how Buddhism is inconsistent with human fracking. And so they all got together and they think of themselves as like the attention activists in Europe. There are different academics who are working on this in a scholarly way. The Strother School is named after a former student of mine, beautiful, beautiful, brilliant young man who was diagnosed with cancer at the age of 31, died at the age of 36, was one of the authors of the 12 Theses. He wrote the 12 Theses with us with a chemo pump hanging around his neck and brought such dignity to our work. He was a former student, as I say. It's run currently by another former student of mine, the very brilliant Peter Schmidt. So this is how we do it. And we're gonna make an impact. And other folks have made, say, you know, there's Tristan Harris, there's Time Well Spent. There was that movie, The Social Dilemma. They're doing a remake. They were just filming the stuff that we were doing in Brooklyn just recently. So we're not the only people doing this, and we're gonna get the frackers before it's over. Here. I remember you. I know exactly who you are. Mm-hmm. Of course. Tell me your name again. Tara. So Tara, I hope you heard that. I'm just saying, like, look, I teach, I'm in an ed school, I have a PhD, I'm in this area. The kids are really not able to read. We can see very clearly the decline in their ability to stay with long-form text. This is absolutely real. I don't know if you're recording this or not, but I'll just say it. Long-form immersive literacy is over. Kiss it goodbye. And it's interesting to say that because, you know, if you're a historian, you probably have noticed that the rise of long-form immersive literacy chronologically maps onto the rise of participatory liberal democracy. So there are grounds for higher level concern about exactly how you refigure participatory democratic life without the form habitus of textual experience. And Neil Postman, some of you will know Musing Ourselves to Death, which is a book on this from 25 years ago. It's not about the internet. It's just about a certain kind of decline in the features of literate culture that Postman, writing in the late 90s, thought were inextricable from participatory democracy. And that book was just republished recently with people being like, wow, Neil, you really got it right. We need you back because you were dead right. So I do want to say, though, that I am, again, very optimistic in this space. And you especially must come out to the Strother School and look on the website, because over the last 2 years, we've developed a new series of programs. Peter Schmidt deserves the lion's share of the credit on this, called Sidewalk Studies. And Sidewalk Studies are a sort of situationist-inspired form of street pedagogy. They are reading, they're book clubs. They're book clubs, entirely self-organizing, youth-driven, and there's one happening every week now. 10 or 12 people come together. It has very particular structure. They read one page. They talk about that one page. And then they do together an exercise that activates the questions at stake in the text. And this is the heart of our revolutionary program. Score-based, practice-based action poems, meaning protocols or like orders of ceremony for joint attentional behavior. They're like choreographies. So you read Octavia Butler, Parable of the Sower, people discuss. Then there's like 2 phases of like going out in the street, walking 10 blocks and looking for situations of change. And so people go out in pairs and they just kind of do a meditative exercise, thinking change, looking for it. They document that, they regather, and they do a kind of final colloquy or conversation that's both about the one page of the Octavia Butler and it's about what happened when they took the Octavia Butler out into the street. They're doing this with Bakhtin, with Audre Lorde, with every text you can imagine, and it's always the same rules. One page, people will read. And if they can do something together so that they can kind of activate it, if you come to the Strother School, that's what we do. It's like turning the basic structure of collective prayer, almost, into a ubiquitous form. It's what I do in my Princeton class. I asked Davey about this. Like every week, we have Monday and Wednesday. Monday is lecture. Wednesday, we do practices. We do stuff. And that is, it's got a relationship to active learning and to practice-based learning. So we didn't invent this in some sense, although, and for that matter, depending on who's in the room, Fluxus was doing this downtown in the late 60s. This is Yoko Ono, Grapefruit. This is Hans Ulrich Obrist's Do It catalog. I could go on for hours about the genealogy of enacted practice-based forms of collective behavior, but it's the form for our time. People will not sit alone and read immersive text. Even my grad students, bless them, it's not like it was, it's just different. Even me, it's not like it was. I wrote a book that had 80,000 words just in the footnotes and the bibliography. It's 815 pages. It took me 12 years to do it. I have read, I have books all over the place. I was made to that world, and it is over. I mean, it'll survive in a few weird rump holdouts the way monasticism has survived. Like, I love Gethsemane Abbey, but it's not like monasticism now is like a major feature of like social order on the continent or something. It's irrelevant. Whereas it used to be the primary form, a primary form of social order. That's over. Reading is the same thing. It's over. Yeah, I do, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's just an extremely hard-hitting question. I'm kind of a congenital optimist, basically. And I'm also like, yeah, I believe in human beings. And I believe that like the flame of the divine is in every one of us. So also like, I believe that we won't be destroyed. But that's really a faith. And there have been dark periods in which many, many, many people were very, very much dehumanized. So one tries to be optimistic, but one recognizes that certain forms of brutalization of the body and of the preconditions for empathic, agential intersubjectivity, those can be brutalized, you know, to the point of unrecoverability. So I'm very, very fortunate that I teach in an environment where I see highly curated students of immense ability who believe in their own intellects and are trying to figure out what to do with them. So I think that biases my perspective to a kind of optimism, but I have colleagues who teach in other kinds of institutions who are already like, I give my students like, you know, a 6-page Zadie Smith story or like a Toni Morrison excerpt, and I can tell it's like giving them a quipu. You know what a quipu is? Those like Peruvian strings with the knots in them that were like the way that like pre-Columbian folks on continental Latin America like communicated information. If somebody just gave you like a string with 12 knots and it was like, could you read the quipu for Wednesday? We're doing the quipu for Wednesday. Just come in ready to talk about it. You'd be like, what do I do with the quipu? I can't. I can't read. Like, and that's like a 5-page Toni Morrison student in college, where people are like, what the hell's the guy talking about? I was like, read this on Wednesday. It's like speaking another language. So in that sense, it's bad. I'm going to come to you, I promise. What I would say, though, on this is, the really terrifying thing that's about to happen, I'm slightly going off script right now, is that, I don't know how many of you are messing around with AI, but like the AI is so unbelievably powerful that those systems are going to suborn us in new ways. It's now like the intimacy economy. They're fully simulacral. Anything a person can do, they can do. And that just means that like everything that is equipped for us to remain interested in another person is now going to be detoured by these machines. I'm guardedly hopeful that we can get ahead of the machines defeating us utterly that way. I don't even mean like a singularity where they like, you know, take over the power grid. I just mean that people deploy them to more deeply frack people for money, that they become the killer app for turning humans into money. And I think that that's very close and needs close attention. But I just believe that we suffer and that we retain an ability to feel the suffering of others and that we will not be destroyed. I believe we won't be destroyed, but it's an existential question. Let's take one more and then I will let people go. Last question. Absolutely. This is like catastrophic. But, you know, when have the kind of close meshed grinding surfaces of capitalism not done greater harm to those who were poorer and less able to defend themselves, you know? I mean, it's like, so yes, and it's not the sort of tranche of the marketplace within which I work, so I feel less able to speak to that like series of problems. They're like, we actually, when we started doing attention labs at the Strother School, we began our first, labs are like our free workshops to bring people together to do attentional, you would love it. You know, as a theater educator, you're actually in the sweetest spot to help, because you all have understood that scripted activation is the way to create occasions before everyone, and you've known it all along. So we look to improv exercises as like a wellspring of attentional protocols. And you can read like everything from, you know, Grotowski to An Actor Prepares, you know, like the whole litany of theater texts are, even Bread and Puppet, you know, is like, it is a theater of a certain kind of a collective, attentional, bracketed occasion. So you're in the driver's seat for what's going to save us, and all of us are coming to you guys because people can't just sit with a book and read, but they can act a scene out, and we do that instead, in a sense. So yes on that. But the class question is just, the first lab we did, we tried going to a set of public schools in the Bronx and Harlem, saying, give us a set of your kids for spring break, we'll actually compensate them, we'll bring them together, we got some money, and we'll run this lab with them. We said, don't give us your best students at these public schools, your charter schools. Give us your like third quintile, fourth quintile students, but kids the teachers can see have more to give than they're giving, because we wanted to hit those kids. The truth is, we learned 2 cycles of that. We're like, we can't. This is way too, you know, this is out of our area of expertise. We need to be social workers. We need to have degrees from Teachers College and special ed. This is not where me and my colleagues from like Wesleyan and a set of my Princeton students, we can't with this, it's impossible. So we ran 2 cycles of it. I would give us a B- or a C+, and we got out of it. We rethought. We're like, you know what? We need to go get the people we can work with, and they can get out and meet the people, do the forms of education and training. We'll teach the teachers. We've gotten into the schools not by working with the kids, but by working with teachers and saying, help us to understand how you could take our exercises and make them work in your classrooms. So it's not enough, but it's what I feel me and the people I know we can do, and then we need to keep bringing people like you all in as allies and teaching us how to kind of keep reaching out, because we're hitting a tiny, tiny tranche, you know, 22 to 42-year-old folks in Brooklyn, most of whom have like a decent undergraduate degree at this point. Now, we also just had a big thing in Telemundo. If anybody stayed on from the Spanish Mass, Telemundo came out. We ran a whole series just with Hispanic teachers in the public schools, and they did a news sequence on our work. So we have some reach, but we need help in that area. I want to let people kind of go home, but listen, you have how to reach me through the Strother School, and if you care about this stuff, stay in touch. We need all the help we can get, and people like you who have a feel for the practices of prayer, which, like Simone Weil said, it's pure attention is prayer. And when we pray, what we try to do is like gather ourselves up in a real way, attentively. And so we have special powers in this stuff because of the traditions in which we've been formed by those forefighters and nuns and priests and parents who brought us to this place. Those abilities are needed now in a new way because of what's going on. So come aboard and help us out.
Thank you very, very much in the name of everyone. The second thing, this is just the first of 4 talks we're going to have. The next talk is going to be given by Ariel. I was embarrassed to pull out my phone during this talk to check the date. So Erin, what is the date? Thursday the 24th of April. Okay, so that's the next talk. Graham, I'm also glad that you said that you love your phone, because I was sitting here with my head down, I'm thinking of all the time that I spend, and I was so happy to say, when you said that you love your phone, you love TikTok. So thank you. It shows